So welcome to our book discussion tonight. My name is Ravi Chandra. I'm the current secretary for the Brown Club of Greater San Francisco, which is the sponsor for this evening. And I'm a psychiatrist, writer, and compassion educator here in San Francisco. Just want to mention that we are recording this event, so please stay muted so your video doesn't show up in the recording. And you can always turn your video off if you want to be sure you're not recorded. But it is good to see your faces as we enter the third year of the pandemic. So hopefully we'll all be able to see each other and you'll get a chance to answer questions. We'll have plenty of time. It's my delight to be here in conversation with my friend, Carolyn Chen. By way of introduction, Carolyn Chen is a sociologist and associate professor of ethnic studies at the University of California, Berkeley. She is class of 1993 from Brown and received her PhD in sociology from UC Berkeley. She previously taught at Northwestern University in the Department of Sociology and in the program in Asian American Studies. Carolyn's research focuses on religion, spirituality, and work in the new economy, as well as Asian American religions. She is the author of Getting Saved in America, Taiwanese Immigration and Religious Experience, Princeton 2008, and co-editor of Sustaining Faith Traditions, Religion, Race, and Ethnicity Among the Latino and Asian American Second Generation, NYU Press 2012. Carolyn has written for the New York Times, Los Angeles Times, and most recently, The Atlantic, and she has spoken on National Public Radio. She is co-director of the UC Berkeley Center for the Study of Religion and a founding member of the Asian Pacific American Religions Research Initiative, APARRI, APARI, maybe we can call it APARI.
It's APARI.
It's APARI, okay. A scholarly community committed, I was gonna say devoted, I wonder if that was a Freudian slip there, committed to the advancement of public knowledge of Asian Pacific American religions. Carolyn and her family live in the Bay Area. First of all, I'm going to turn to gallery view for myself here to get a sense of our audience. We have so far 25 people. If you could use the reactions to say how many of you work in tech. So just raise a hand or put your thumb up to show. I see a couple people, 3 people, 4 or 5. So about maybe about a quarter of the audience works in tech. And how many of you have practiced meditation at all? Let's see, I see, yeah, maybe a few more than that. So more people probably who have practiced meditation. All right, great, welcome. And there will be ample time for questions after our conversation, and you can always drop them into chat. Well, welcome. So tell us, Carolyn, what got you interested in this project and what was your process to get this book into our hands? And a reminder, if you could stay muted, that would be great. Other people could stay muted, that would be great.
Yeah, so, well, first of all, I just want to thank you, Ravi, for organizing this event. As I was saying earlier, you've been my most enthusiastic promoter, so I'm so grateful to you. And I also see some friends out there in the audience. So Brown, class of 93, hey. Good to see you all. Okay, so let me get to your question that you're asking me is how I got interested in this project. So I am a sociologist of religion, and I, as a scholar of religion, I am accustomed to studying religious things. So I normally study, so in my first book, I study Taiwanese immigrants, evangelical Christians and Buddhists. And religious scholars typically study religious things, people who identify as religious communities, religious texts, religious institutions. But if any of you, live in any major metropolitan city in the United States, you know that religious affiliation and religious participation has really declined pretty dramatically in the last 20, 30 years. And so I was really interested in understanding the presence of religion in secular spaces. You know, how do we understand religion in this particular moment in time, in what, you know, some scholars would call a secular age? So I was really interested in looking at religion in secular spaces. And so my project actually started by me looking, studying yoga. And so studying yoga studios. And I spent time doing a lot of yoga, but also interviewing yoga practitioners. And I normally do sort of a spiritual biography. I learn about their narratives, their biography, and I would ask people, why do you practice yoga? When do you practice yoga? How do you use yoga in your life? And invariably, the topic of work always came up. They would always say things like, well, I practice yoga at the end of a long day so that I could stretch, relieve my stress. And they would also say things like, well, getting on the mat, practicing yoga helps me become a better, and here you fill in the blank, nurse, engineer, teacher, lawyer, doctor, whatever it is. And so as a scholar of religion, here I was looking at what I thought, I was interested in studying yoga because these are practices that come from Hinduism. And if you look in yoga studios, they have religious icons, religious practices. And yet what I noticed, that what was really sacred here was not the practice of yoga, it was actually work. Their lives revolved around work. Work was the thing that centered their lives. Work was what they were willing to get headaches for, to, you know, rupture family relationships for, you know, to get migraines, to lose sleep over. This was what they were devoted to, and rather yoga was something that was therapeutic instead. It was ancillary, actually, in order to help them do their work better. And so it was then that I decided, you know, I really, in order to really understand what's sacred in this time among professionals, I really need to be looking at the workplace. And so it just so happened that my husband and I were on sabbatical we're going to go on sabbatical at Stanford. At the time I was a professor at Northwestern. And so then there we were in Palo Alto, just in the heart of Silicon Valley. And it was just, you know, and there I was, it was easy to just then look at tech firms.
Okay, so from yoga to the workplace to Silicon Valley. And so what was your process from that moment to bringing this book into fruition?
Oh, wow. Okay. So that was, I started this project in 2013. And I conducted over 100 interviews with tech professionals, people in HR, mindfulness and meditation teachers, Dharma teachers, the people, you know, you call them entrepreneurs, right? But I call them meditation entrepreneurs, essentially the people who are bringing meditation, mindfulness, and spirituality into the workplace. I also spent 5 years conducting field work. This was spending time in tech firms, meditating a lot, attending professional development seminars, also
Having some good lunches at the
having some
campuses?
very good lunches. Yes, having some good lunches, taking dance classes, hanging out, getting lots of snacks, but also attending things like mindfulness and work conferences. So actually, Ravi and I, we reconnected because we were attending Wisdom 2.0 conferences as well, because you were doing research on your book, Face Food, at the time.
Right, so much research and 9 years of work. So yeah, I just have to emphasize this is a wonderful book. I hope everyone gets a chance to read it, and because I think it has so much to say about where we are in this early 21st century, particularly here in the Bay Area. Well, you know, I have written that in college my religion was biology,
Mhm.
and then medicine. Now medicine is my religion, or ideally, I suppose, as a psychiatrist, as the Dalai Lama says, my religion is kindness.
Mhm.
I think of all of these iterations as recognitions of how consuming these vocations or avocations are, and how they can bring awe, belonging, and some form of transcendence of self and connection to a bigger picture. But what's different about work being religion in Silicon Valley?
Mhm. So let me just back up here and talk about the main argument of my book. The argument is that work is replacing religion in Silicon Valley. And as a sociologist, I'm mostly interested in how institutions shape our lives. So we've heard of the expression before of people worshiping work, right? That means that they're devoted to work, they give all their time and energy to work. Well, that's one aspect of what I'm talking about, work replacing religion. But I'm also talking about how the workplace, how companies are replacing the functions that religious institutions once played. They're meeting the needs for identity, belonging, meaning, purpose, and spiritual care that Americans had once turned to religious institutions to fulfill. So that's one aspect of the argument that of my argument is that I'm finding that tech workers, and I would argue that Silicon Valley is a harbinger for things to come in what I call knowledge industry hubs, like Silicon Valley, Portland, Seattle, Cambridge, New York, Los Angeles, et cetera. And so where we're seeing that professionals, high skilled workers in America are turning to their workplaces to fulfill their needs for identity, belonging, meaning, purpose, identity, transcendence. The other part of the equation is that we see that tech companies, and I would say many corporations in general, are looking to provide for the spiritual care of their employees because this is essentially a way to make them more productive and to make them higher performing. So, for instance, we see that it's very common now for companies to bring in spiritual practices like meditation and mindfulness into the workplace. But there's also practices like executive coaching, for instance, where many of the executive coaches that I interviewed brought in spiritual practices to help their especially senior leaders in companies to help them align the deepest part of themselves with their work. Companies are also offering spiritual benefits such as a weekend retreat at a spiritual center, right? And this idea is that when people are spiritually whole, when they're whole in mind, body, and spirit, that they perform at their best. And this is something that very few people would find hard to argue with, right? So if I can just back up here, what I'm arguing is that here we see this manifested in Silicon Valley, but I think that this is a trend that has been for a long time in the making, that I would argue that's been on the making for the last 4 years. So what we've seen in the last 4 years, starting the late 1970s, is that we've seen religious affiliation rates decline dramatically. Well, sorry, I wouldn't say dramatically, but slowly in the last 50, 60 years. But what we also see starting in the late 70s is that high skilled workers and professionals in the United States are devoting more and more of their time to work. And so we have this kind of conventional and traditional way of talking about how work is extractive, right? How work is soul sucking. It takes from our time and energy. But what gets lost in this I think, very traditional narrative or discourse of work is that I think that in the last 4 years, we don't realize that actually work is not only taking a lot from us, but it's also giving a lot to us. So it's taking from our time and energy more than ever. Professionals are devoting more time than ever to their work. But work is also giving to us in the sense that it is now the institution that is the primary source of identity, belonging, meaning, and purpose for high skilled Americans.
Hmm. Well, you illustrate these points so wonderfully with profiles in your book, and maybe you have a profile or two that could chart this transition. I'm thinking particularly of the one young man who moved from the South to
Yes.
the Silicon Valley.
Yeah. So there was an interesting trend that I found early on in my interviews was that people had this pattern of losing their religion once they moved to Silicon Valley and started working in Silicon
Just
Valley.
like the song.
Yes, losing my religion, right? So yeah, for all of us in class of 93, remember the REM song, Losing My Religion. Um, and it was the inspiration for the title of my chapter. but but one of the things that I had noticed was that people okay, so first of all, let me just start by saying that no one from Silicon Valley is from Silicon Valley. Almost everyone moves there from somewhere else. And so I call them all tech migrants, essentially. They're migrants, they may be coming from Korea, they may be coming from Germany or China, but more of them are coming from places like Kansas, Georgia, Texas, Oklahoma, et cetera, right? So these are usually generally young men who are moving to Silicon Valley. And what I noticed is that many of them may have been religious before, but when they moved to Silicon Valley and then started working in the tech workforce, that they lost their religion. And what I found was that essentially that the workplace, their startups or their companies had become their new faith communities. So I tell in the book the story of someone that I call John Ashton, who moved from Georgia. He was the president of his Christian fraternity in college. And when he was in college, his fraternity was his entire social life. It provided meaning and purpose for him. He told me about how during spring break, when all of the other frat guys would be, going to Florida for parties, that he and his brothers were going to Mexico to build orphanages. So it gave him a very distinct identity and mission in life. After that, he stayed in Atlanta and he worked as a programmer for a bank where he said a really easy job. It was a 9-to-5 job. And that gave him the time to be really active in his church. He played in the church band. Again, this was sort of the institution that he said grounded him in life. Well, when he moves to San Francisco and he joins a startup, he finds that basically he's working 70 hours a week. So he really doesn't have time anymore for friends, a faith community, or a community outside of work. Instead, his startup becomes his faith community. The startup I call in the book Harmonize. So now, instead of being a Christian, that's his primary identity. His primary identity is being a harmonizer, along with those in the company. He eats 3 meals a day with these folks. He does all of his social activities with them. But it's also the company that gives him his sense of purpose and meaning in life. Just as his faith had given him a sense of meaning and purpose to spread the gospel, now it was to change the world. And it was to change the world with this social networking app. And it was so fascinating because he would use with me this Christian language, the missionary language of, we have this burden. He kept on saying, we have this burden to change the world. And so it had essentially, this new mission, this purpose now replaced his old mission, his Christian mission. And there was also this element of faith because startups, 9 out of 10 startups fail in Silicon Valley. So if you're working in a startup, you have to have this faith that you're going to be the 1 out of 10, right? That either gets acquired or you IPO. And that requires that same kind of faith that you might have in God. So he poured all this religious energy the fervor that he had at once applied into his church and his faith. And now it was all directed towards his company.
Wow. So that phrase that has a link to San Francisco, drinking the Kool-Aid,
Yes.
really comes into play. You use that phrase. So we'll
Let me
talk
talk about
about
that.
that.
He would talk about that too. It was actually a term that was used a lot in Silicon Valley and among the people that I interviewed. And I would say that it was a term that always was followed by sort of nervous laughter, because and I think that in that people knew that there was something true about it, right? That they knew that there was Kool-Aid involved, that there was drinking the Kool-Aid that was involved. And, John Ashton, he tells me a story about essentially how at first when he met the startup founder who was telling him and using sort of all this kind of very typical Silicon Valley language, like, we're going to change the world with this app. He was telling me, like, I thought this guy was crazy. I thought he was totally crazy. But then he realized but then after working in Silicon Valley, he started to talk like that too. And he talked about how he too also had to drink the Kool-Aid, that if you're going to participate in this world and you're going to like work all the time with the belief that you're going to be the one intent to succeed, well, you have to drink the Kool-Aid.
Right. There's in Silicon Valley, that TV show, it's what is it, something like, we're gonna save the world by making your files smaller. It's like, it seems so, so disconnected.
Yeah, well, people
So
told me things like that. People told me things like that with a straight face and really and with very, very earnest and very much believing that.
right. So maybe that's a good, I want to ask about corporate maternalism, which is one aspect, and this idea, which is part of drinking the Kool-Aid. The professional is the personal, or sorry, the personal is the professional.
Mhm.
So yeah, how do those
Yeah,
tie
so
in?
corporate maternalism is a concept, is a term that I use to describe how tech companies provide for the personal care of their employees in order to make them more productive. So this is sort of what, when you hear about tech companies, how they have at least in pre-pandemic times, but now they're starting it up again, of course, is like, the cafeterias, the massages, the smoothies, the laundry, the, dog groomers, the hair cutters, the dentists, et cetera, right? All of these things that the company provides. And it's this sense that, that companies, so this idea that the personal is the professional. And it's this idea that when I would speak to human resources professionals, this idea that people performed at their optimal when they were at their personal optimal, when they were physically, socially, and spiritually whole. And so because of that, because of this concept, right, which, I mean, many people would celebrate, like, what's not to like about a holistic workplace, right? And because of that, it then becomes the imperative of companies to provide for the physical, social, and spiritual well-being of their employees. So this is not just providing the cafeterias and the gyms, but it also means providing for the hobbies. People would talk to me about how HR folks would arrange concert tickets, social events, and then, but also providing for their spiritual well-being. So this might be bringing in spiritual leaders to give talks, teaching people meditation, mindfulness, offering them sort of classes in spiritual well-being. So caring for them through all of these dimensions of the person. And I call this corporate maternalism because this is the kind of care that we often associate with mothers, right? That kind of nurturing of body and mind and soul. And in fact, one of the tech workers that I interviewed, he told me, well, the HR people in our company, well, they're kind of like mom. They make sure that we eat our vegetables. I mean, there were actually signs, that they needed to eat their vegetables. They needed to drink 8 glasses of water a day, picking up after them. And he said to me, they're the ones who go to Safeway and Costco. They're providing for us in all of these ways. So it's sort of so it's yes. So corporate maternalism refers to that sort of holistic care of the employee. And I just have something really funny to say is that my 13-year-old son told me today that he finished reading my book. And I thought I was like, wow, you read my book. I didn't even see him reading it. And I said, well, what'd you think? And he said, well, I think that Silicon Valley would be a great place to work. So
Well, sure, and yeah, I think so many people just coming out of college think that landing a job at Facebook, Google, Amazon, Apple, are they finally achieved nirvana, right? To use another religious metaphor. But yeah, I mean, this idea of corporate maternalism, it really reminds me of. I don't know if you know of Erich von Neumann, a Jungian psychologist. He talks about the great mother archetype, and
mm,
it's the all-providing mother.
yes, mhm,
But the downside is the all-providing mother demands total obedience
yes,
and rigidity. And the
exactly.
classic example is the military, right?
Yes,
So,
exactly.
so yeah, I mean, so what's the downside? I mean, what's the problem? Why is it a problem that Silicon Valley companies are becoming mothers and providing for all of these aspects and
Mhm.
becoming religions in the way they're promoting themselves? Mhm.
Yeah, yeah. So let me just back up a little bit. Something that I forgot to mention here is that, in terms of like the spirit, so they're taking on more and more aspects, right, of other institutions. Essentially, the company is no longer just a place, it's not just a job, it's not just where you work anymore, but it's becoming the neighborhood bar. It's becoming your gym. It's becoming your local restaurant. It's becoming your home. It's becoming your temple. It's becoming your church. It's becoming your meditation center, et cetera, et cetera. And in this kind of situation, a lot of, especially when it comes to spirituality and spiritual practices, these are often perceived as actually perks, right? These are perks of the company. Now let me get to your question here. What is the downside? Because I mean, when I when I was there, I agreed with my son. I was like, what's not to like about this, right? I mean, I would have these amazing lunches for often free, or they were heavily subsidized, and then it was like I would go home, it's like, oh, now I have to make dinner, now I have to clean up, you know what I mean? And often I was at these places and I would think, I would be a much better professor, I would be a much better mother if the university cared for me like this as well. And so
It's kind of like a welfare state, a European welfare
yeah,
state
absolutely.
on
It's
Facebook's
even, it's
campus.
even, I mean, come on, it's better than any European welfare state. It's like, you have to, part of, part of the thing, Ravi, is that these companies have so much money that they're not just, they're not the state. I mean, it's absolutely not just it. They have so much more. The resources they have are astounding, right? And they use this all as a way to compete for talent. I mean, when I would be hanging out with these folks, they were always talking about like, oh, this company has these kinds of snacks, oh, but we have these kinds of snacks. So all of this care, these were all sort of symbols of, there was this whole status, the ranking of snacks, in these companies. So here, what I want to say is that, look, um, professionals in the United States are working lots of hours, 50, 60 hours a week. Um, if we had this kind of care, it would be an amazing kind of thing, these kinds of services and perks, right? And you'd think, well, what's not to like about it? Isn't this a win-win situation? And that's how people felt in Silicon Valley. Um, what if you took away the laundry service? Well, then I would have less time to work, or I'd be working the same, but I wouldn't have clean clothes, or I would be more stressed out, right? So in a way, these are services and perks that many of us would very much enjoy, and that actually have a functional value. So I don't want to downplay that. But one of the things that, as a sociologist, I was really interested in, what are the social consequences of having places like, where you have corporate maternalism. And here I call it, what I call Silicon Valley is techtopia. So essentially, techtopia is a society where work becomes the highest source of fulfillment. And techtopia is, of course, a play on utopia, but it is actually, you know, in my view, a dystopia. It is utopia for those elite members who can work in a tech company.
Hey, yeah,
I'm gonna wait there for you. Don't worry. That's why I called you.
Hi, I'm sorry. There's someone who's I think can you all mute yourself? Okay, I think we're set now. So I know, still figuring out Zoom. This happens to me all the time too. But yeah, so I was talking about techtopia. So it's this concept where work becomes the highest source of fulfillment in society. And I talk about it as a form of dystopia because I'm interested in what are the social consequences of this. And essentially, I talk about what happens in a techtopia is if we were to compare the workplace to a giant magnet, okay, a giant and powerful magnet, and all the other social institutions in society. So these are families, these are faith communities, these are libraries, these are arts organizations, neighborhood associations, etc. That these are other magnets that are competing for what are metal filings, and we throw them on a table, which is the time, energy, and devotion of the community. Well, what we see happening in techtopias is that you have this huge magnet of the workplace. And in comparison, all the other social institutions are these small magnets that are shrinking in size, essentially, because you have this huge magnet that's attracting all of the energy, time, and devotion of a community. So if you have these magnets all spread out on a table, and then you spread a whole bucket of metal filings over this table, you'll see that all of the metal filings, which represent the time, energy, and devotion of the community, are going to gravitate towards this huge, magnet, right? And then what happens to the other magnets? Well, they lose, they're not attracting the time, energy, and devotion, right? And here again, I use this analogy here of the magnet very purposefully, because this is what work is doing. Instead of that extractive model that work is taking from us, I really think that the way that work is operating in professionals' lives is that it's attracting their time, energy, and devotion. And so what we see happening then is that for any of these other smaller institutions and weaker institutions to compete for the time and energy and devotion of the community, that essentially they need to service the workplace, they need to service work, or they need to adopt and conform to the logic and the goals of the workplace. So here, let me give you an example. One of the people that I interviewed was a Zen priest. And he told me that who was also an engineer, former engineer. And he told me that people weren't, that the members in his temple were dwindling, and people weren't coming to the morning meditation anymore because they were too busy working. So for him, he said, well, because they're so busy working, why don't I then bring meditation to the workplace? Which is what he did. But in the process of bringing meditation to the workplace, and he did it through an official program, through HR, he had to adapt and he had to change his teachings and the practices of meditation so that they conform, essentially, so that they can conform to the goals of the workplace. So, I would talk to many meditation and mindfulness instructors, and the companies would say, well, can you teach this in 15 minutes? Because otherwise you're taking too much time away from the workers, right? Dharma teachers would tell me that essentially that they had to they had to take out the ethical teachings from the Dharma because, well, they weren't being hired to teach businesses how to be more ethical. They were hired to teach workers to be more productive and higher performing. So essentially they had to then So they had to compromise their teachings. Christian pastors also told me similar things. Well, work is the center of people's lives, so why don't we bring the Bible study to the workplace instead? And so they would participate in what are called employee resource groups. And so these are sort of similar to like student clubs, at a university. But here's the thing, is that when they would bring their Bible study or their fellowship group to the company, they essentially had to then replicate the stratified caste system of the tech workplace, where only salaried employees would be able to participate in it. So essentially, participating in a Bible study became sort of a workplace perk that only salaried employees can participate in, but not the janitor, not the cafeteria workers, not the bus drivers. So if you think about it in comparison, these faith communities outside of the workplace might be much more class diverse or racially diverse. So one of the big problems with techtopia is essentially it's taking sort of the resources from all other social it's essentially impoverishing. It's at the cost of other social institutions. And I mean, this is not a new story. I mean, what we've seen is the story in the last 60 and 70 years is a pretty dramatic decline in civic participation among all Americans. And what we've been seeing, in the last, in the last half century is essentially the hollowing out of our civic institutions. But what's the one institution you have to participate in? Well, it's the workplace, right? We can choose. We don't have to participate in the Rotary Club. We don't have to participate in a faith community, any of these other organizations or institutions. So what's left, I find, is essentially that work is this last institution that is left standing. But that offers a very sort of powerful gospel of meaning and purpose to Americans.
Well, yeah, so you certainly hit one of my triggers, as it's probably a traditional trigger for Brown alums, is the idea of equity. So within this techtopia, there is elitism, the people who are able to access all these benefits. And then, of course, the tech sector itself is an elite within the society, which is distorting so many things about society. And we could talk for hours about that. But yeah, I want to talk about that because I think so in terms of what the problem with why Silicon Valley is making work a religion maybe is part of what it leaves out of the religion, which so many religions it's about. I mean, I think the golden rule, right? Do unto others. Google had do no evil. That's changed. And also the idea of overcoming narcissism and promoting equity, I think, is universally part of traditional religions worldwide. So is this something that's really different in Silicon Valley and in tech as they manifest as a religion?
Well, certainly a lot of those things are left out. I mean, I would say most of the ethical teachings are left out in this, religion of work in Silicon Valley, because especially if they work against the bottom line, for sure. And so yes, certainly many of those things are left out. I mean, I'm thinking about the Zen priest that I talked about, right, who went to teach meditation in a tech firm. Well, he showed me this brochure that he made for the tech firm that he was supposed to get hired in. And one of the topics that he wanted to talk about was learning to live with failure, which is, I would say, a fact of human life, right? That we all encounter failure at some time. And he told me that, and he told me at the last minute, the company decided not to hire him, and that they decided instead to go with a professional meditation firm instead, a professional meditation teacher. And, I didn't have the heart to tell him this, but I knew why. because I talked to those other meditation instructors who were saying, well, we're going to make your workers twice as productive. We're going to make them focused. And they used all these numbers and and metrics and so forth. But teaching your employees how to accept failure, well, that wasn't something that companies wanted, right? Let me talk about also one of the other downsides of making work your religion or your faith community, is that essentially, a lot of the language now in companies, words like, for instance, we use that this is so commonplace, this is not just Silicon Valley, is talking about work as a source of passion, as meaning, as a calling, right? As a mission. It is essentially the colonization or the borrowing of all these terms that we use in the private sphere in institutions such as families or religions where devotion and loyalty have no bounds, right? And now these words, these concepts, these feelings are being transferred and being used in the workplace. Well, the problem with making the workplace your religion or your faith community is that once you're no longer productive, once your skills are no longer provided, you are no longer part of the faith community anymore, right? And there's no such thing as unconditional love in these faith communities, in companies, right? And this is something that I was really keenly aware when I was studying folks in Silicon Valley's this keen sense of obsolescence that they had, because they knew that at one time that the languages, the programming languages, the skills that one would need, that the industry was changing so quickly that they knew that there would at one time be that they would become obsolete. So there was sort of this obsession with constantly optimizing the self, whether this is by fasting through these are actual religious disciplines, right, of fasting or meditating, or on the weekend spending time learning kind of new skills, new programming languages, etc. But there was, again, just the sense that they could be obsolete, that they would be obsolete at one point in their lives, and that there was always this constant desire to keep on kind of being marketable. And essentially that's what your membership in these faith communities is dependent on, is the marketability of your skills. And once you're not marketable, you're out.
Oh, so I have so many questions. I do want to make sure we have time for audience questions. If you do have a question, you're in the audience, you can drop that into chat, and we'll find a way to get to you, hopefully before the end of the evening. But in the meantime, while we're waiting for that, I have some more questions. And you use that word, productivity, and such implies such the subordination of one's self to the corporate goals. And so that's one thing. And so you talk about a number of ways of in this chapter, killing the Buddha. That's based on that Zen Quan. If you meet the Buddha in the road, kill him. And that has a different meaning in Buddhism, in Zen Buddhism. But you suggest the entrepreneurs, the meditation entrepreneurs, might actually be killing the Buddhism or killing the Buddha himself or itself. Can you walk us through this? I mean, I had this question, maybe, I don't know if you know the answer to this, but I mean, are they doing ninja Buddhism? Are they trying to help workers address whatever suffering in their lives? Are some of these workers going to go deeper into exploring their suffering, or is it really primarily focused on productivity? And yeah.
Yeah, that's a really great question, Ravi, because I think that when people read my book, I think that that they might say, oh, well, these people are essentially just cogs in this capitalist machine, right? And I use that term, killing the Buddha, really because to leave it ambiguous and really sort of open to interpretation, right? About really what this means and what they're doing. And so on one level, you could look at them and you could say, well, they're feeding the capitalist machine, they're appropriating Buddhism to make workers more productive. But I'll tell you that every single person that I interviewed who is a meditation entrepreneur, meditation teacher, or Dharma teacher, bringing, meditation and mindfulness to the workplace, they were all very sincere and they were all very spiritual folks themselves who had a very deep practice, who really, when I would sit down with them and we'd close the door, productivity was the last thing on their minds. They were not so interested. That wasn't necessarily their goal, but they knew that that's how they had to frame it in order to get into the corporation, right? And many of them saw themselves as, they would say, sneaking in spirituality or bringing some sort of practices that in fact could reduce their suffering in the workplace. And so many of them saw themselves as being, bringing in these therapeutic practices, helping bring wholeness into the workplace. But so these were the personal stories and motivations of people. But I think that we need to then understand this in this sort of larger kind of structure in the system, is that for many of them, they had been teachers who maybe, whose real heart was to bring meditation to classrooms, to prisons, to community centers, to Dharma centers, to meditation centers, but they wouldn't get paid much in those spaces. And for any of you, I think most of you are Bay Area folks, I mean, the cost of living here, right? And so in order, and especially, especially because of the tech industry, it has increased the cost of living here. So this is another one of, you could say, the casualties or the consequences of techtopia. It has raised the cost of living for everyone, so that people who don't participate in techtopia essentially have to find ways to service techtopia in order to do the things that they want to do. So essentially, none of these people were like, I want to bring this to Google, but it was more like, I have to bring this to Google in order to live, and to maybe in order to like bring it to schools or to prisoners, in the weekend, on the weekend, or as a hobby.
Yes, so there's some great questions. I'm gonna, if the participants are willing, they can unmute themselves and ask their questions directly. Otherwise, I will ask the question. So, Lisa, do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question? Okay, she's not coming up. All right, anyway, I will ask her question. Oh, there she is. Okay, all right, yeah.
No, it's okay, Ravi, you can go ahead. I can't really read it in the dark so well.
Oh,
you can
okay.
read it for me. I'm cool.
Okay, all right. So Lisa's question. Lisa is the president of the Brown Club Board, so thanks for being here, co-president. So she says, she asks about the role of ritual you found in Silicon Valley. In Judaism, for example, it is the ritual of Friday Seder, etc. That is very grounding and marks time. What did you find in this regard in Silicon Valley?
Yeah, that's such a great question. So I want to answer this question in terms of ritual and practices, and then also about time, as separately from that. But so, for one thing, many of these workplaces, and this is pre-pandemic when I conducted my study, they would offer, you could eat 3 meals a day there. And so I talk about how essentially people would break bread together, 3 times, 3 times a day. So they would have these meals. They had things like, and here we might think of this, well, how does this compare to a religious ritual? But they had rituals such as 5 o'clock video game hour. 5 o'clock, we stop work and we play video games, right? Or happy hours, or all hands meetings. I mean, all hands meetings really, I think, take the place of like a really inspiring service, where a worship service where people all come together and they're essentially worshiping the company, the work that they're doing. the mission of the company and reminding themselves of like, we're a team, you know, this is what we're trying to accomplish, et cetera, right? I mean, there's other rituals instead of say, wearing, say, like marking one's identity by wearing a religious icon, say a cross, or you know, essentially, I mean, this is so commonplace that we don't even think about it, but in Silicon Valley, everyone's wearing a company t-shirt, or right, or they have like company logos on their backpacks, and that this is what identifies them. I mean, they call themselves this too. So there are these rituals, but it's simply that they don't necessarily call it a ritual, right? But there's something else too when you talk about time, which I think is really distinct about religion and here, like religious traditions, not work traditions, but religious traditions, is the marking of the sacred through a kind of sense of time and the manipulation of time. This is what all religious traditions do. And they create sacred time through creating particular spaces that are special, right? That are sacred, days of the week that are sacred, and the use of incense or the use of bells, the use of clothing, the way that we dress to set off that time as sacred. And this is what companies do not do, because companies operate not on liturgical time, but by corporate time, which is all about efficiency, because time is money. And so that even if you try to create something like the time for meditation, I would talk to meditation instructors who would say, well, you know, this is a really big challenge because the company says that it's taking too much time to meditate. So at first, a meditation program started as 1 hour a week, and then the managers were complaining, so it got bumped down to 30 minutes a week. And then people continued to complain. So then now it was 15 minutes a week. And then they just got rid of it altogether. And instead they had a meditation app where essentially it's completely erasing any sense of the sacred, because now you get to choose whether you meditate for 1 minute, 2 minutes, or if you have a lot of time, you can meditate for 5 minutes now, right? And you can meditate anytime and anywhere. Well, that is essentially about convenience. That's not about ritual or you know, honoring something that's sacred.
Oh yeah, in my own book, I say only half jokingly that social media has all of its rituals, which make it almost a religion. We want people to worship at our posts, etc. And the Apple store is kind of a cathedral in itself. And Steve Jobs and others have been called the high priests of Silicon Valley. So I think there is, you know, I think you've hit on a definite theme here. I'm also wondering. Yes, we have another question from Chen Xing Han, who has a great book on Asian Americans in Buddhism in America, and she asks if any of your, and this hits actually one of your profiles, I believe, if any of your interviewees left Silicon Valley or tech, left the religion, as it were, and if so, where they did find meaning, belonging, community, etc.
Yeah, that's a great question, and thanks, Chen Xing, for coming out tonight. Yes, actually, one of the people that I talk about in my book who left Silicon Valley, I talk about, you know, if I can just give you a little of her backstory, is that essentially she left her startup because she had a crisis of faith. She was one of these people, you know, who was eating all of her meals at the startup, and her whole life and social life revolved around the startup, and was really wrapped up into the mission and the purpose of the company. And then had found out that one of the claims that the company had made about their product was false, and that that she had a crisis of faith about that. She basically had to, and it actually wasn't just her, but many people in the company too, because the company could know the product and couldn't support the claims that it had made about the product. They left the company, and for her it was such a crisis of faith that she just had to leave Silicon Valley altogether. And she ended up going into graduate school and becoming a writer. But she did find a community of faith. She did find a community, and it was actually in a Buddhist community, which is really interesting because she had started meditating when she was working in the firm, but she started meditating very much as like a productivity practice. She wasn't very involved. It was simply just as a productivity practice. But it was only after she left the company that she was really able to engage in Buddhism as more than a productivity practice. She actually ended up, becoming a convert to Buddhism, and that's where she found her meaning and belonging and community. So it's this thing where what I found was that essentially that if you're involved, if you're so wrapped up sort of in the religion of work, you really don't have time for religion. You really don't have community anywhere else, because basically the company provides it.
Yeah, that was such an interesting profile, because that was an Asian American who found meditation through her workplace and then found Buddhism, which is considered more of an Asian religion to begin with. So yeah, so I thought that was an interesting transition. It's like me learning yoga from white teachers, for example, and then taking it up. So it's that same kind of circulation through that. Yeah, so let's see, there are a couple more questions I see. So what differences have you seen in terms of shifts in the last 2 years of COVID?
Yeah, that's a great question. It was like, I finished writing and then COVID hit, and it was like, oh, this is so inconvenient. Like all of my findings are pre-COVID. So I actually, by the time COVID hit, I had stopped my formal research, but I want to just talk a little bit about, what has happened, because obviously people started working from home. And I think what I've seen, at least from the people that I've spoken to, is religion. So a couple things here is that because work is remote, it cannot provide in the same way that it used to, right? And so it doesn't have the same kind of hold in people's lives that it had before, because it is no longer associated with sociality with your friends. It can't provide the kind of spiritual care. It can't provide the kind of physical care. I mean, I know some people that I talked to said, like, I gained a lot of weight. I'm not healthy anymore because I don't have the company food anymore, right? So I think that work it doesn't have the same kind of appeal or the same kind of attraction and hold. And at the same time, I think people have been experiencing that they've been working more hours simply because they don't have to go to work anymore. So what people have been telling me is like, oh, so then we could schedule the meetings at 8, right? Because you don't have to commute. So there's even less of that boundary between work and home. And I think that that's contributed a lot to the burnout that we have been reading about that's happened among professionals during the pandemic. Is A, they're working more, but B, they no longer have the social and spiritual benefits of work. It was, when I talked to HR professionals, burnout was like the thing that they were most concerned about. And how are they going to prevent burnout? Well, they were going to do that by providing the meals, providing the hobbies, providing the meditation. And now they can't do that. So I think that that's one of the things that's going on there. And so I think that, we've heard there's so much talk, right, about the Great Resignation, you know, and I recently wrote an article in the Atlantic that kind of talks about the Great Resignation, and you know, it has our attitudes about work really changed, which is what has been kind of we're reading about in the New York Times and all the papers and et cetera, kind of this claim like work is no longer work anymore, right? People don't worship work. And my argument is that, you know, I quote this really a famous quote from the late writer David Foster Wallace. And he says, there's no such thing as atheists. We all worship something. The only difference is that we get to choose what we worship. And so to me, you know, are people still worshiping work? You don't stop worshiping work by getting a new job, by baking sourdough bread, by going on vacation. You know, these are kinds of the things that people have been citing as evidence, like work is no longer work anymore, because actually a lot of people are changing jobs to get more meaningful jobs, right? And so I think that the question for me is, to answer the question if people are worshiping work is, are there other institutions that are taking the place of work that are providing us with identity, belonging, and meaning? And if there isn't, then you're still worshiping work. That's sort of like the default mode that I think that most professionals are in. And so even if you're working hybrid now, or you're going into work 3 days a week, or you're just still going, you know, you're working through the computer, work is still the sort of the primary institution around which your life revolves around. And if you're not creating, if we as a society are creating other, you know, what I call houses of worship, and this could be unions, this could be neighborhood associations, you know, other civic associations and clubs and organizations that sort of feed our desire and sense of purpose and belonging, then by default, most of us are still going to be worshiping work. I hope that answered your question.
Yeah.
But
Yeah, well, maybe people are turning to those, and I think, you know, it's all about understanding people who are maybe living different lives than you, might be suffering in different ways, have different challenges, and you know, society and ideally a religion, I think, would help one do that. But this idea of compassion, certainly, I think is so much in the air as well. And actually, the next question comes from William Peel, who's a compassion educator. If religion says your worth and it relates to compassion, if religion says your worth transcends productivity, it seems the tech world teaches that worth is all about productivity, which becomes a direct source of suffering. Do tech employees recognize this as suffering?
That's such a great question, William. I don't know if you go by William or Bill, but you know, I know that I interviewed one person who, the Zen priest that I talked about earlier, he told me that actually Zen made him less ambitious, you know, and the people that I interviewed who were, what was interesting was that who was able to escape this vortex, the religion of work, who was able to resist the vortex of work? Well, they were people who essentially belonged to organizations or institutions outside of work. And many of these people were themselves religious. Essentially, to resist the religion of work, they needed to be worshiping something else, another religion. So do tech employees recognize this suffering? I would say that some people did, if they had a sense of self and belonging and purpose outside of the workplace. They had an alternative, their traditions, their communities offered them an alternative perspective to understand work, and to understand that work could be the source of suffering. But I think that people who were in it, I don't think that they really got that. I mean, let me say that everyone that I interviewed said that there is more to life than work. Everyone, you know, even the tech worker who's working 80 hours a week would tell me this. You know, we learned to say this, but very few people were actually able to live this. there's a difference between being able to sort of say this as a slogan versus being able to live it. And the people who were able to live it were able to live it because essentially they had these other magnets that were pulling them. So again, I would say that many employees did not recognize this as suffering until they became sick. I mean, there were people, I mean, I told you I interviewed over 100 people, and between the ages of their early 20s to their 70s, but many of the people I interviewed were in their 20s, 30s, and 40s. I mean, I interviewed 3 people who became paralyzed because of work. Like they just had these unexplained paralysis. I mean, this is pretty extreme, and they then realized that it was because of work, but something had to happen that was pretty extreme, like I can't move anymore, or I got shingles, or it often manifested through physical illness, that they realized, wait, something else is going on, and I need to change.
Interesting. So another question. Has anyone from the tech community, or I would say from the Buddhism or the spiritual or the meditation entrepreneur communities, have any of these folks responded to your research and findings?
Yeah, thanks for that question, Brad. Oh, class of '93. So what's been really interesting is I've had people from tech who have sort of confirmed or affirmed, like, this is what life is like in a tech firm. And yes, like, you do get so wrapped up in it. It does become your world, that it is like a religion. They just don't use that word religion, right? So people have said that this corresponds with their own experiences. I have to say, Brad, I had some trepidation, like when this book came out, because I'm like, what are people going to say? Are people going to hate me? Are people going to, well, it's mostly like, are people going to hate me, right? Because this is a critique.
And you're specifically critiquing the sense of ethics, social responsibility, equity, I think, is that right? And the kind of connection to the bigger community.
Yeah, absolutely. And then also techtopia in general. I think that, I am critiquing the idea that should companies really be the ones that are providing our social and spiritual care? I mean, when they do this, it ties us to our work, to companies in a different kind of way. And do we want, is this what we want? And so here's what I found really interesting, is that I feel like I'm getting a lot of interest from the tech community in my research, but these are people who are in the tech community but critical of it. And so these might, and some of these are actually kind of like Gen Z folks, who are like, okay, I know I'm starting this job, I know I'm in it, but I know there's something deeply wrong with it. So help me put words to this experience. Help me to kind of go into this with my eyes wide open. There are people who are, it's interesting because and here's, one thing that I give the tech folks a lot of credit for, is that they don't need their egos stroked. They're actually like, okay, give it to me, tell me what's wrong, and either I'll disagree with you or I'll change. And people are willing to kind of be critiqued. And so I do, see that. I mean, I find it really, Ravi, you're talking about the mindfulness community, and I recently got this an email from someone who is leads this mindfulness training in corporations, who brings mindfulness training to corporations. And then they said they wanted to make my book one of the, one of the core textbooks in their training. And I was like, have you read my book? But I don't know. I guess they're open to it. But and I think that's a good thing, that if this book can start.
Drink your Kool-Aid with a side of criticism, maybe.
Yeah. I mean, it's all good. But I was sort of wondering if they had actually read it. But we'll see.
Okay. One more question, I think, from the audience, and maybe a closing question. Can you speak, from Laura, can you speak to any distinctions you saw between big tech versus startups? For example, more emphasis on maternalism at one of the big five versus drinking the Kool-Aid in a small org?
Yeah, I think that's a really, really great question. I think I saw a lot of variation here. There were, so I think that in the startups, it was sort of the sense that it was, always like all hands on deck. And so that each person really felt very valuable, and that they had to be, and many of them also saw the big payout at the end, right? That either the company could, they might benefit from the big payout at the end. So I think that there was more of people at startups tended to work more, and they had this kind of much more of this drink the Kool-Aid mentality. On the other hand, startups usually didn't have the kind of money to support the kind of corporate maternalism that you would see at a place like Google. So they were sort of, so that would really vary place by place. But in terms of like the big tech companies, like you would see, there was definitely variation. I mean, you could see much more traditional companies, like a place like Oracle, where they really had very slim kind of benefits and perks, and they didn't necessarily participate in all of like the spiritual care. Whereas in the sort of big five that you're talking about, they were, these companies have so much money that and they literally like have an army of organizational behavior professionals, organizational psychologists, who spend all their time essentially figuring out like what color to paint the walls, how far to put the snacks away from you, what kinds of snacks to use in order to get you to be more productive. And what was just fascinating is that these workers would tell me how they would be getting like survey after survey. And I was always like, doesn't that feel sort of weird that they're just trying to like do all these things and manipulate, the color of the walls, like the way the office is set up to see how productive you are? And they're sort of like, nah, no, that's just sort of par for the course, so yeah, for sure at some of these companies, they just had abundant resources. And essentially I had this feeling, and I mean, some of these vendors would tell me that essentially like they'd hire anyone who walked in who could say like, we can make your worker more productive. Or if they could say something like, well, Google's doing it, you should hire us too. So there was definitely that sense like you always had to one up the next company in terms of your perks, because this is how you were going to retain and attract talent. So yeah, for sure. I would say though, just again, just a little bit more, is that in the smaller organizations and the startups, the sort of care, if they had the money to do it, it was much more tailored and custom. I remember one person that I spoke to kind of talked about how essentially that HR person was literally like the mom, kind of figuring out everyone's food preferences, their likes, their favorite books. Like they were able to kind of tailor care to such a level of specificity that it was really unimaginable, kind of crazy.
Wow, interesting. I have so many more questions, and I've maybe two final questions, unless there's something else from the audience. But one is, after all of this work and research, what new questions came up that you you would still perhaps want to pursue going forward, or that you still like are still open?
Yeah, I mean, I think that for me, I left this project really wondering about what we can do as communities and what we can do in society to build up our civic institutions and to build up um, organizations, civic spaces that that could really draw our attraction and draw our energy and time. And how can we create these spaces that are more equitable? So when I talk about techtopia, what's happening is that essentially the workplace has a monopoly on the social and spiritual and material benefits of a society. And what I'm really interested in now is in thinking about how can we create cities? How can we create communities? How can we create essentially, how can we create communities where the social, spiritual, and material benefits are distributed more equitably across institutions, and that might shape us in different ways, and that might give us identities and value us for more than our productivity?
Wow, that question is is alive for me, and I hope remains alive for everyone in our audience. And finally, to close on something you said in your introduction, our conversations made me critically re-examine the meaning of work in my own life. How so? Do you think your own work has elements of being a religion or religious practice, and what changed in this re-examination?
Oh gosh, yes. I mean, I thought about this. I thought about this all the time. I always compared myself. I mean, I had a lot of empathy and compassion for the people that I studied, because I saw how work was providing for them, taking over their lives, but also providing for them, providing meaning and identity. And it really caused me to examine, I should say, the place of work in my own life, and the place and how it gives me also a sense of identity, meaning, and purpose. And I can't say that I have any clear answers or solutions to this, but it definitely made me examine it. And it made me, think about, well, who do I know who lives a healthy life? And what can I do to create a more healthy work-life balance? And I know that some of you folks are from Stanford out there, so some of you might know Russell Jung, a good friend of mine. He's the guy who also started Stop AAPI Hate. I went to graduate school with him, and graduate school is in many ways like these tech workplaces where you have these small cohorts, everyone sort of competing to be like the alpha student, and it can be a really toxic place. And Russell was this guy who kind of just floated above it. And the reason why is because he had this really active community life outside of school. And so he just, like, nothing ever bothered him, nothing ever disturbed him. And his sense of identity and meaning and purpose, it was not based in the sense of a calling or vocation as a sociologist or of his work. It was really based in something else, in a community that gave him unconditional love and valued him for who he is. And so I took that as I take that as sort of a model of a way to, as a way to have work-life balance. I think that all of the sort of time management pundits have it wrong. It's not about managing our time better. It's really about finding these other sources of worship and devotion outside of work that can pull us and identify, and that can give us identity and meaning.
Well, thank you so much. I'm so glad that you at least devoted almost a decade of your life into this work, and it's such an important work that I think should and will start conversations around all these issues of society and work. So thank you, Professor Carolyn Chen. Work, pray, code when work when work becomes religion in Silicon Valley. Yes, yes. So
thank you so much.
you.
Thanks, Ravi. Thanks everyone for coming out on a Wednesday night, especially all you from the East Coast.
All right. Thank you, everyone.